On the night of April 10th in the year 1241, a Hungarian soldier stood watch on the banks of the SHADOW River. His name is lost to history. Just another young man, pulled from his village to serve his king. He stamped his feet against the April cold, breath fogging in the darkness, eyes straining to see beyond the riverbank. He had been told the enemy was out there, somewhere. Tartars, they called them. Devils from the east. Behind him lay the might of Hungary. 60,000 men camped within a ring of wooden wagons. It was the largest army Central Europe had assembled in living memory. Knights in gleaming armor slept beside their war horses. Crossbowmen from a dozen cities checked their bolts by firelight. Bishops and archbishops had blessed this holy enterprise. King Bela IV himself lay in the royal pavilion at the camp's heart, confident that God smiled upon his kingdom. They had driven back an attack on the river bridge just hours before. They believed they had won the day. In the command tent, Duke Koloman clinked goblets with the Archbishop of Kalocsa. They had held the bridge. The Tartar scouts had fled before Hungarian steel. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated. These eastern nomads were just men after all, not the demons the refugees had described. They would finish this business in the morning and return home as heroes. This was the last mistake they would ever make. What the soldiers saw next would haunt the nightmares of Europe for generations. The fog shifted, and through it came shapes, dark riders emerging from the mist as if born from it. First 10, then 100, then 1,000, and still they came. Rank after rank of mounted warriors materializing from the darkness in perfect, terrible silence. Their horses made no sound. Their armor did not glint. They moved like shadows given form, like death itself riding out of the east. 20,000 Mongol warriors had crossed the river in the night, and now they stood in battle formation, waiting for dawn. The soldier opened his mouth to scream a warning. He was dead before the sound left his throat. To understand what the Hungarians faced that night, you must first understand the Europe of 1241. This was Christendom at its zenith. The great cathedrals of France were rising toward heaven, stone prayers written in flying buttresses and stained glass. The Pope in Rome commanded the spiritual loyalty of every soul from Portugal to Poland. The Holy Roman Emperor ruled a patchwork of German principalities that stretched from the Alps to the Baltic Sea. Kings and dukes and bishops divided the continent among themselves, squabbling over borders and titles, fighting their little wars over honor and inheritance. They believed they were the center of the world. They believed God had chosen them above all peoples. They had no idea that far to the east, something was coming. Something that would make their petty wars look like children's games. From the Silk Road brought tales of a great empire in the east, a warlord who had united the savage tribes beyond the great mountains. Armies of horsemen who ate raw meat and drank the blood of their enemies. Cities that had fallen and been erased from the earth. But the East was far away, a land of myth and exaggeration, populated on their maps by dragons and dog-headed men. Surely these were travelers' tales, embellished for a free drink at the tavern. Surely no army could cross the endless steppes, the towering mountains, the vast distances involved. The merchants smiled and collected their coins, and the nobles laughed and returned to their feast. They could not imagine what was coming. They could not conceive of a man like Temujin, who the world would come to know as Genghis Khan. His name was Temujin. Born around 1162 to a minor chieftain on the harsh Mongolian steppe, he spent his childhood in poverty after his father was poisoned by rivals. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to survive on roots and rodents in the wilderness. He was captured and enslaved as a young man, escaping with nothing but his life and an iron determination that would reshape the world. By 1206, through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and absolute ruthlessness, Temujin had done what no one before him had accomplished. He had united the eternally warring tribes of Mongolia under a single banner. They gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the oceanic king. He was 44 years old, and he was just getting started. What followed was the most explosive military expansion in human history. In 1211, the Mongols invaded the Jin dynasty of northern China. Within 3 years, they had shattered armies 10 times their size and captured Beijing. The Great Walls meant nothing. The vast distances meant nothing. The Mongols moved faster than any army before them, covering 60 miles a day when European armies considered 20 miles a hard march. In 1219, Genghis Khan turned west. The Khwarezmian Empire, modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia had insulted his ambassadors. It was a fatal mistake. Within 2 years, one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth had been systematically dismantled. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were erased from existence. The Mongols didn't just defeat their enemies, they annihilated them. At Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan, the Mongols demonstrated what happened to cities that resisted. Merv was one of the largest cities in the world, a jewel of Islamic civilization with libraries, observatories, and mosques of stunning beauty. It surrendered peacefully, hoping for mercy. There was no mercy. The Mongols marched the entire population onto the plain outside the city walls. Then, systematically, they killed them all. Men, women, children. The elderly, the sick, the newborn. Contemporary historians estimated the dead at over 1 million. They built pyramids from the skulls. When a Persian chronicler passed through years later, he wrote that he could still hear the bones crunching beneath his horse's hooves. The message was clear: resist, and your people will cease to exist. In 1227, the universal ruler fell ill during a campaign against the Western Ye Kingdom. He was 65 years old. Sensing his death approaching, Genghis Khan summoned his sons and his most trusted generals to his bedside. What he told them would echo through history for the next 2 decades. His empire, he declared, would not end with his death. His successors must continue to ride. They must ride west until their horses' hooves touch the waters of the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. Every kingdom that lay between Mongolia and that distant shore must submit or be destroyed. It was not a request. It was a command from beyond the grave. And there was one man in that tent who would dedicate his life to fulfilling it. His name was Subutai. Subutai was born around 1175, the son of a blacksmith in a minor Mongol tribe. He was not royalty. He had no noble blood. He rose through the ranks on pure tactical genius alone. By the time of the European campaign, he was 66 years old. His body had grown so heavy that he could no longer ride. He had to be carried to the battlefield in an iron cart. But his mind remained the most dangerous weapon in the Mongol arsenal. In his career, Subutai conquered more territory than any general in history. More than Alexander, more than Caesar. He won 65 pitched battles and never lost one. He conquered 32 nations, and now he turned toward Europe. Before Hungary, there was Kiev. To understand what the Mongols were capable of, you must understand what Kiev was in December of 1240. It was the mother city of the Rus, the cultural and spiritual heart of what would one day become Russia and Ukraine. 50,000 people lived within its walls. The golden domes of St. Sophia's Cathedral blazed like captured fire in the winter sun. Merchants from Constantinople and Baghdad traded silk and spices in its markets. Monks copied sacred manuscripts in its monasteries. The bells of 40 churches rang out across the frozen Dnieper River. Kiev had stood for 400 years. It had survived Vikings and nomads and civil wars. Its people believed their city was protected by God himself. They were about to discover how little that protection was worth. In late November, the first Mongol scouts appeared on the hills east of the city. Within days, the entire horizon had turned dark with riders. A contemporary chronicler inside the walls wrote that the squealing of Mongol wagons, the bellowing of their camels, the neighing of their countless horses was so loud that people inside Kiev could not hear each other speak. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, sent an envoy to demand surrender. The people of Kiev threw the envoy from the walls. It was an act of defiance. It was also a death sentence. For 9 days, the Mongol siege engines pounded the walls. On December 6, 1240, the walls finally cracked. What followed was not a battle. It was an extinction. On December 6th, a section of wall near the Polish gate finally collapsed. The Mongol warriors poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. There was no organized resistance. The defenders had been exhausted by 9 days of bombardment. The Mongols moved through the streets systematically, killing everyone they encountered. Men, women, children. There was no discrimination. Some citizens fled to the Church of the Tides, the oldest stone church in Kiev, believing that surely the Mongols would not violate a house of God. Hundreds packed inside, priests and nobles, and common folk pressed together in the darkness, praying for salvation. The Mongols simply collapsed the building on top of them. The weight of desperate believers was too much for the ancient walls to bear. The roof came down. The screaming stopped. Of Kiev's 50,000 inhabitants, perhaps 2,000 survived, mostly young women taken as slaves. When the killing stopped, Kiev had ceased to exist. 6 years later, a papal envoy named Giovanni de Plano Carpini passed through on his way to the Mongol court. He wrote that the fields around Kiev were still white with human bones. Inside the ruins, he counted fewer than 200 houses still standing. The great city had become a ghost town, a memorial of bones and ashes to what the Mongols could do. And even as Kiev smoldered, Subutai and Batu Khan were already planning their next move: Hungary, Poland, Germany, the heart of Europe itself. They would strike in spring. It was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Most generals think in terms of battles. Subutai thought in terms of continents. He would split his forces into multiple armies, attacking across a front of 500 kilometers simultaneously. One army under Prince Biter would strike north into Poland, not to conquer it, but to destroy any Polish army that might reinforce Hungary. The main force, led by Ögedei Khan with Subutai as chief strategist, would invade Hungary from 3 directions at once, through the Carpathian passes in the north, the center, and the south. These armies, separated by mountain ranges and hundreds of miles, would coordinate their attacks to occur within days of each other. In an age when messages took weeks to travel, Subutai would synchronize a continental invasion. The Europeans had never seen anything like it. They couldn't even imagine it was possible. In early 1241, 130,000 Mongol warriors crossed into Europe. They came through the Carpathian passes in multiple columns, flowing around the mountain barrier like floodwater, finding every crack in a dam. The people of Poland and Hungary had heard rumors of what happened to Kiev. They had heard the stories from refugees streaming west, but hearing about the Mongols and seeing them were 2 very different things. The Europeans had been fighting each other for centuries. They thought they understood war. They were about to learn how wrong they were. In early April, Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia gathered every soldier he could find at the town of Legnica in southwestern Poland. The response to his call was impressive. Polish knights in their distinctive winged helmets rode beside grim German crusaders bearing black crosses. Moravian cavalry came from the south. French Templars, warrior monks who had never known defeat in open battle, arrived in their stark white mantles emblazoned with blood-red crosses. Perhaps 25,000 men assembled on the fields outside Legnica. It was the largest Christian army in Poland. Henry knew that King Wenceslaus of Bohemia was marching north with another 50,000 men. If he could hold for just one day, the combined European force would outnumber the Mongol raiders. He decided not to wait. He decided to attack. It was the worst decision of his life. Duke Henry gave the order to charge. 25,000 European warriors surged forward, the thunder of their hooves shaking the frozen earth. Heavy cavalry lances lowered into attack position. This was the moment European knights lived for, the glorious charge that had dominated warfare for centuries. The Mongols appeared to break and flee before the Christian onslaught. The Europeans pursued, hungry for glory. But the retreat was a lie. The Mongols had been perfecting the feigned retreat for generations. As the European formation stretched and scattered in pursuit, Mongol riders began circling behind them. Then came the smoke. The Mongols ignited screens of burning reeds that rolled across the battlefield, blinding the Europeans. Through the smoke, voices screamed in Polish, "Biegać! Biegać! Flee! Flee!" Mongol warriors had learned these words specifically to create confusion. Knights turned, thinking their own side was retreating. And then the arrows came, from every direction. Thousands of arrows per minute from enemies they couldn't see. The trap had closed. Duke Henry the Pious died fighting. When his horse was killed, he fought on foot, surrounded by the last of his household knights. A Mongol lance took him in the chest. His head was hacked from his body before he hit the ground. The Mongols paraded it on a spear before the walls of Legnica, showing the terrified townspeople what remained of their duke. Of the European army, almost no one survived. The Mongols collected ears from the dead to count their victory. It filled 9 large sacks. 400 kilometers to the south, on that same day, Subutai prepared to spring his main trap. King Bela, the Fourth of Hungary, had assembled 60,000 men, the largest army in Central Europe. They had made camp on the SHADOW River near a place called Mohi. That afternoon, Hungarian forces had driven back a Mongol attack on the river bridge. King Bela believed the Mongols were merely testing his defenses. He ordered his army to rest. They would deal with these raiders in the morning. What he didn't know was that while he watched the bridge, 30,000 Mongol warriors were silently building a pontoon crossing 5 miles to the south. While the Hungarians slept, Subutai executed the most brilliant tactical maneuver of his career. 30,000 warriors crossed the icy SHADOW River on a pontoon bridge his engineers had built in total silence. At dawn, Mongol catapults began bombarding the main bridge. King Bela did exactly what Subutai expected. He rushed his reserves north to defend the crossing. The main bridge was a decoy. It had always been a decoy. And then, from the south, from a direction the Hungarians had not thought to defend, 30,000 Mongol cavalry emerged from the morning mist. The Hungarian camp was struck from 2 directions simultaneously. Within minutes, the largest army in Central Europe was fighting for its life. The Hungarian camp became a slaughterhouse. 60,000 men found themselves surrounded, their own wagon walls now trapping them inside with the enemy's arrows. The Mongols poured fire into the camp from every direction. Tents burned, horses stampeded, men screamed and fell and died. King Bela tried to organize a defense, but there was no defense against an enemy you couldn't reach. The Mongol horse archers stayed at distance, loosing volley after volley into the packed mass of humanity. But Subutai, ever the chess master, had left one gap in the encirclement, a single opening to the west. It looked like an escape route. It was actually the cruelest part of the trap, because running men cannot fight back. When the Hungarians saw the gap, they broke and fled through it, exactly as Subutai intended. The pursuit lasted 2 days. Mongol cavalry hunted the fleeing Europeans across 30 miles of Hungarian countryside, killing them by the thousands. King Bela IV escaped the slaughter, barely. He threw off his royal armor to ride faster, abandoning everything that marked him as king. With a handful of surviving bodyguards, he fled west. Behind him, his kingdom was dying. The Mongols pursued him for weeks, across rivers and through forest, never quite catching the fleeing king. Bela rode until his horses collapsed beneath him, then found fresh mounts and kept riding. He would not stop until he reached the Adriatic coast, hundreds of miles away. In a single morning, he had gone from commanding the largest army in Central Europe to being a refugee in his own land. Hungary had lost perhaps a quarter of its entire population in the invasion. In 48 hours, Subutai had accomplished something unprecedented. He had coordinated 2 devastating victories across 500 kilometers, destroying the armies of both Poland and Hungary within 2 days of each other. No European power remained capable of stopping the Mongol advance. Vienna lay only weeks away, essentially undefended. Germany beyond it was fragmented and unprepared. Italy was divided into squabbling city-states. Mongol scouts rode within sight of Vienna's walls, marking routes for the main army to follow. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, perhaps the most capable ruler in Europe, sent desperate messages advising his subjects not to face the Mongols in open battle. He understood. Against these enemies, the tactics that had won European wars for centuries were worse than useless. Europe held its breath. The end seemed inevitable. 6,000 kilometers to the east, in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, a very different scene was unfolding. Ögedei Khan, third son of Genghis, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, was doing what he did most nights. He was drinking. Ögedei was by all accounts an intelligent and capable ruler. He had expanded the empire, built roads and postal systems, administered conquered territories with surprising efficiency. He had also inherited his father's legendary appetites. His doctors, alarmed by his deteriorating health, had ordered him to limit himself to 1 cup of wine per day. Ögedei's solution was elegant. He commissioned a special cup, one that held 3 pints. On the night of December 11th, 1241, Ögedei sat drinking with his favorite companion. He had no way of knowing that his next few hours would determine the fate of European civilization. Ögedei drank through the night with a man named Abdurrahman. Cup after cup of wine disappeared down the Great Khan's throat. As the first light of dawn crept into the palace, Ögedei Khan collapsed. His doctors rushed to help, but there was nothing to be done. Decades of excess had finally claimed their due. His liver, his heart, his body had simply given out. The Great Khan was dead at 56. In a palace 6,000 kilometers from the battlefields of Hungary, the man who had ordered the conquest of Europe had drunk himself to death. The most efficient communications system on Earth, the Mongol Yam postal network, carried the news westward. Fresh horses at every station, riders who never stopped. It would still take months to reach Hungary, but when it arrived, everything would change. When the message finally reached Hungary in early 1242, Batu Khan faced the most consequential decision of his life. His grandfather's command echoed in his memory: ride until you reach the Great Sea. Vienna was weeks away. Germany lay open. All of Western Europe could be his. But Ögedei's death meant a succession crisis. Batu had rivals who would happily seize power while he was campaigning on the other side of the world. If he continued west, he might conquer Europe and lose everything at home. If he returned east, Europe would survive. Historical records show that Batu never actually returned to Mongolia. He withdrew from Hungary, but stopped in the Russian steppes, building a new capital at Sarai. He would rule the Golden Horde from there for the rest of his life. But Europe, he left behind. In early 1242, the Mongol army began to withdraw from Hungary. It was not a retreat in the military sense. No European army had defeated them. No fortress had held against them. It was a strategic redeployment, a calculated decision to consolidate rather than extend. But to the surviving Hungarians, it looked like a miracle. From their hiding places in forests and marshes, from the cellars of burned villages, and the ruins of destroyed monasteries, the survivors watched in disbelief as the nightmare began to recede. Tens of thousands of Mongol warriors, the same force that had annihilated their army and devastated their kingdom, simply turned and rode east. The thunder of hooves faded, the smoke cleared, and Hungary, broken and bleeding, was somehow still alive. So why did the Mongols really leave? Historians have debated this question for centuries. Ögedei's death certainly played a role. The succession crisis gave Batu Khan a reason to withdraw. But modern science suggests another factor. Tree ring studies from the region show that the winter of 1241 was unusually harsh, followed by an exceptionally cold and wet spring. The Hungarian plain, which the Mongols needed as pasture land for their vast horse herds, had turned into a waterlogged marsh. The grasslands that had fed Mongol armies across half of Asia simply didn't exist that year in Hungary. Horses that could cover 60 miles a day on the steppe found themselves sinking knee-deep in mud. The composite bows that gave Mongol archers their deadly advantage began to delaminate in the constant humidity. Ögedei's death gave Batu a political reason to withdraw. The weather made withdrawal practical. Together, they saved Europe. Whatever the combination of reasons, Europe was saved. The Mongols would never return in force. But survival came at a terrible cost. Hungary had lost somewhere between 15 and 25% of its entire population. Whole regions had been completely depopulated. The Kingdom of Poland had lost its duke and the flower of its knighthood. Across both countries, survivors emerged from hiding to find their world transformed. Villages that had stood for centuries were ash and memory. Fields were choked with the bones of the unburied dead. Churches that had offered sanctuary had become mass graves. King Bela eventually returned to his shattered kingdom. He spent the rest of his reign building stone castles across Hungary, determined that if the Mongols ever returned, his people would have fortresses that could not burn. They never came back, but Bela never stopped preparing. But what if things had been different? What if Ögedei Khan had put down his cup 1 hour earlier? What if the spring of 1242 had been dry instead of wet? What if Batu Khan had ignored politics and followed his grandfather's command to ride until he reached the Atlantic? Historians have long debated what might have happened. The evidence suggests that no European army could have stopped the Mongols in open battle. Every force that faced them was destroyed. Stone castles might have slowed them, but the Mongols had conquered fortified cities across China and Persia. Dense forests might have hindered their cavalry, but they had adapted to every terrain they encountered. The most likely scenario is not total Mongol occupation, but something like what happened to Russia. Centuries of domination, with European kings reduced to Mongol tributaries, their crowns held at the pleasure of a distant Khan. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, the rise of Western civilization, all of it might have unfolded very differently. Even if the Mongols had pressed on, there were limits to what they could have achieved. Western Europe was different from the open steppes and mud brick cities they had conquered before. Stone castles, properly garrisoned, could hold out for months or years against siege. The dense forests of Germany and France were poor terrain for cavalry. And ultimately, there was the sea. The Mongols tried twice to invade Japan. Twice their fleets were destroyed by storms. Britain, protected by the Channel, would likely have remained unconquered, an island of European civilization waiting to reclaim the continent. Even empires have boundaries. Geography itself would have fought back. Subutai returned to Mongolia after the European campaign. He would lead one more great expedition against the Song dynasty in southern China, before age finally claimed him. He died in 1248 in his early 70s, having conquered more territory than any general in human history. In his final years, perhaps he looked at maps of the lands he never reached: Vienna, Rome, Paris, the Atlantic shore where his master had commanded him to ride. He came closer than anyone before or since to conquering the entire known world. He was stopped not by any army, but by a drunk 6,000 kilometers away. 250 years later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of a small ship called the Santa Maria, staring west across the Atlantic Ocean. In his hands, he held a well-worn copy of Marco Polo's account of his travels to the court of the Great Khan. Columbus wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for the old one, for China, for the legendary wealth of the East, for the lands the Mongols had once ruled. The Mongol Empire had been gone for over a century, but its shadow still shaped European dreams. When Columbus sailed west, he was chasing a ghost, the ghost of an empire that had terrified Europe, and then, just as suddenly, vanished back into the steppe. In April of 1241, the Mongol horde stood at the gates of Western civilization. They had destroyed every army sent against them. They had killed hundreds of thousands and enslaved thousands more. Vienna lay weeks away, undefended. Germany was fragmented. Italy was divided. No force on earth seemed capable of stopping them. And then they turned around. A drunk Khan's death in distant Mongolia. A wet spring that turned grasslands to marsh. A political calculation that prioritized power at home over glory abroad. For whatever combination of reasons, the Mongols rode east and never returned. It was the closest Europe ever came to annihilation, the closest Western civilization ever came to ending before it truly began. And almost no one today knows it happened. Remember the Hungarian soldier who stood watch on the banks of the SHADOW River? He died that night, an arrow through his throat before he could scream a warning. His name was never recorded. His grave was never marked. He was just another young man, pulled from his village to serve his king, and he died in the dark without knowing why. But because men like him fought and died that night, because a Khan drank too much wine 6,000 kilometers away, because spring rains turned Hungarian grasslands into impassable mud. You exist, the language you speak, the cities you live in, the history you learned, the civilization you inherited, all of it balanced on choices made by people whose names you will never know. 800 years ago, the shadow of the horde fell across Europe, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, it lifted. You are living in the world that remained. Somewhere in Europe tonight, someone is walking down a quiet road at sunset. Perhaps they pause for a moment and look east toward a horizon that stretches unbroken to the edge of sight. They don't think about what almost came over that horizon 8 centuries ago. They don't know the names of the soldiers who died at Legnica, or the peasants who burned at Kiev, or the families who drowned in mud at Mohi. They don't know about Subutai's maps, or Ögedei's wine, or Batu Khan's choice. They just see an empty road, a clear sky, a world at peace. They have no idea how close it came to being otherwise. Perhaps that's as it should be. The shadow of the Horde has finally passed, but it's worth remembering once in a while just how dark that shadow was. This is the other timeline, where we explore the paths not taken